Hello everyone and welcome to another tech video. A few weeks ago I mentioned that I was thinking about upgrading this PC here, the HP ProDesk 400G4, a small form factor office computer from 2017. This is in fact the first PC I ever personally bought about 2 years ago now, for a price of about £120, and it's been my main computer since the day I received it. Before talking about how I want to upgrade it though, let's look at the specs first. This HP ProDesk office computer has an Intel Core i5-7500 processor clocked at 3.4 GHz, a single stick of 8GB DDR4 2400MHz RAM, a 250GB SATA solid-state drive, integrated Intel HD Graphics 630, and everyone's favourite operating system of all time, Windows 11. And it gets worse. This is the RTM release of Windows 11 from 2021, which means it's just an unnecessary skin over Windows 10, and has annoying bugs that shouldn't exist. The only real advantage with this version of the OS is that there's no Copilot or AI crap anywhere. Anyway, enough ranting about Windows. The reason why I want to upgrade this computer is because it's just a basic office PC, nothing more. I would like to get more performance out of it by upgrading the RAM and inserting a graphics card to help speed up day-to-day tasks and maybe even do some lightweight gaming. To begin with though, let's have a look at what this 8-year-old office computer can handle as it is. I'm pleased to say that for the past 2 years of owning this computer, it has handled 1080p video editing mostly okay, although somewhat slowly at times, but it does work, and it also handles 1080p video streaming as well. In fact, all the content that I've created in most of my channel's history has been done on this computer. That's exactly the reason why I bought this PC in the first place, as the previous computer I was using was a 2015 Lenovo laptop that wasn't even mine, and could barely handle rendering HD video. So I needed a cheap but capable desktop computer of some kind. Other day-to-day tasks, such as browsing the web and watching YouTube videos in full HD, is also pretty much flawless. It's not much of a surprise considering the computer isn't a decade old yet, and has a decent Core i5 processor. Now for the more interesting part. What can this office computer handle in terms of gaming? I've already run some benchmarks on some games, both modern and classic, and considering the lack of power from the integrated Intel HD Graphics 630 that this computer has built in, you should probably set your expectations to low right now. I started off with BallisticNG. This game originally launched in early access back in 2016 and is still updated in 2025. This is the latest development build running in 720p and graphics settings set to medium overall with VSync enabled. With these settings, we get an average of 30 FPS most of the time, but in some instances the frame rate would fall below 20, especially when there was lots of scenery or weapon effects on screen. I ran the same race again with VSync disabled and the frame limiter to 30, and it made noticeable improvements to the frame timing with a bit less stutter, but at the cost of bad screen tearing. These are in fact the settings I've always used when playing this game. It's playable, but could perform much better. I also ran an eliminator race with the same settings, and despite the amount of chaos happening, the results were just about the same. Next, I wanted to push things a bit harder. Here's Crash Bandicoot N. Sane Trilogy, which launched on Steam in 2018, 1 year after this PC was released. All the graphics settings were set to lowest at 1024x768 resolution. Even with these low settings, the game barely managed 30 FPS at all. In all fairness, it didn't look the worst, but the Intel HD graphics just can't handle games like this very well without huge sacrifices to the resolution. Things only got worse when I tried a level on Crash Bandicoot 2. The frame rate averaged 22 FPS and fell to 10 whenever there was ice on screen, probably because of all the reflections. Hilariously, the game ran so bad that it just broke. Not kidding, when you fall down this pit, you're supposed to be teleported to the last section of the level, but it just didn't happen. Either this was a fluke, or the game just hates being run on such poor hardware. I then pushed things even harder with BeamNG Drive. This is an old beta available on Steam. I had to use this because I wasn't confident that the latest version would even run, as it needs 16GB of RAM, but of course the PC just has 8GB of RAM. Anyway, with the game running in 720p resolution and using a mix of low and normal settings, it ran at 30 FPS most of the time, with occasional stutter. Everything looked a bit ugly with these settings, mostly because of the lack of shadows, and naturally spawning more vehicles or using more intensive maps would impact the performance further. So overall, running this outdated version of BeamNG on an 8-year-old office computer was not really a great experience. I then tried something much older. This is Portal 2, using DirectX 9 and running at 1080p with medium graphics settings. This resulted in a stable 30 FPS most of the time, and likely would have been a bit higher if the laptop power savings option wasn't enabled in the settings. I only noticed after recording that I left this enabled, so this meant the game had an artificial frame cap of 30 FPS. Whoops. Luckily the game ran very smooth and looked great thanks to how well optimized it really is. I only encountered frame drops when walking through portals, but unsurprisingly the loading screens between chambers would cause huge stutters, which is why the lowest frame rate was 1 FPS during the benchmark. Here's some PSP emulation using the PPSSPP emulator and a copy of WipeOut Pure. In the emulator settings, the game is being run in 4x native resolution, which is roughly the same as 1080p, the native resolution of my monitor. All other settings were set to their respective defaults, if I remember correctly. Despite the GPU being almost at full load the whole time, the game ran at a near perfect 60 FPS with no noticeable delay or stutter, resulting in a fully playable experience with a smooth looking game. I should also mention I was using a cheat code which caps the in-game frame rate to 60 FPS. I would recommend having this enabled when playing this game on this emulator, so the cheat code is linked in the description below in case you want it. Next up is Roblox, something that we've all heard of, even if it might not be for the right reasons. I chose to load AW674's Robot Wars, a game that is developed by one of my brothers. It's quite graphically intensive and I thought it'd be good to test on this PC. Unfortunately though, you can see from the footage here that the PC can barely handle this game without turning the graphic detail down to a very low level. And weirdly, I couldn't get a frame rate counter to show on Roblox. Whether I used MSI Afterburner, River Tuner, Fraps, or even Bandicam, it just wouldn't show for some reason, so we'll just have to roughly guess. Judging from the footage, the game ran at about 25 to 30 FPS with low graphics settings, but turning it up any higher made an awful impact on performance, making the game unplayable. You can turn the detail to lowest, allowing you to play the game at a smooth 60 FPS, but at what cost? It looks terrible. Finally, let's end the benchmarks with the biggest task yet. Here is the latest version of the 3D Mark demo on Steam. This software allows you to push your PC to its absolute limit by running very intensive graphical benchmarks. I was going to run Steel Nomad to begin with, but that actually wasn't possible due to how weak the PC is, so I had to run the light version instead. After waiting for the benchmark to load, it did run at 2 FPS. Yeah, the RAM and the GPU were completely maxed out during the whole 1 minute of the benchmark. Keep in mind this is supposed to be the benchmark for lightweight PCs. This is just awful. After the benchmark finished, the PC was given a shocking score of 313. In all seriousness, this benchmark was released just last year, making it 7 years newer than the PC itself, so it makes sense it doesn't work very well here. But it's still a bit funny to see the poor hardware trying its best. I also run a couple more benchmarks. Time Spy, which uses DirectX 12, didn't fare much better than the previous test, with roughly the same frame rate throughout. After the test finished, the score was 408. The Firestrike test, however, ran a little bit better than the previous two tests, with a slightly higher average frame rate. In the end, it scored 930. This could be because it's a DirectX 11 test. So that's it for the benchmarks. Hopefully you now have a rough idea of what this old office PC is capable of. With that out of the way, let's look at what can be done in terms of upgrades. I did some research and found a manual for this exact PC on HP's website. That sounded so boring. Straight away, I was annoyed to see that the power supply is a measly 180 watts. This does limit what can be done in terms of GPU upgrades, so I looked at other possible upgrades for the time being. It turns out that the motherboard can support up to a maximum of 32GB of RAM by inserting two separate 16GB modules into both slots on the motherboard. I don't need this much and felt 16GB in total would be plenty, so I considered ordering a single 8GB module to pair with the existing 8GB of RAM that's already in the PC, which would total 16GB. The processor can also be upgraded to a Core i7-7700, however these are quite expensive, averaging around £50 to £60 from where I looked. I wasn't too bothered about upgrading the processor anyway, so I just skipped this for now. I then came across a video explaining the upgrade process for this PC. I'll have this linked in the description for those who want to check it out. Some suitable GPU upgrades were also mentioned, including the AMD Radeon RX 550 low-profile graphics card from 2017. After doing further research on compatible GPUs, I decided that the RX 550 would be decent for this PC in terms of compatibility, performance and price, and I came across one on eBay for just £40, so I placed an order. I also went on the CEX website and ordered, for just £4, an 8GB DDR4 2400MHz desktop RAM module. This would be paired with the existing 8GB module in the PC, adding up to 16GB in total. And after all that waffle, the parts are here. First, this is the 8GB of RAM I ordered from CEX for £4. I received a Corsair Vengeance variant with a fancy plastic housing over the module itself. And in this pink protective bag is the AMD Radeon RX 550 low-profile graphics card that I ordered from eBay for £40. Judging from the info on Tech PowerUp, this is in fact a Dell OEM version of the card, which I assume would have shipped with select Dell PCs back when it was new. It has 4GB of GDDR5 VRAM and runs on the PCIe 3.0 X8 interface. With the parts ready to be inserted, I made sure the PC was unplugged and then removed the top panel by unscrewing the single thumb screw and sliding the cover away from the case. Oh yeah, and you can see I've got rubber feet on the side of it so it can stand up. The RAM can only be accessed by removing the drive bay, so I went and did that first. This involved unclipping the front panel by pulling all 4 clips one after the other. There you go. That's the front panel off. Unplugging the power and data cables from the SSD, and then pushing in the metal clip on the side of the drive bay to release it from the case. I then realised that I didn't unplug the cables from the optical drive, so I quickly fixed that mistake, and then that allowed me to remove the drive bay from the case. This then gave access to the RAM slots on the motherboard. The first slot was already populated with an existing 8GB module, so I unsecured the clips on the second slot, aligned the new 8GB module with the slot, then firmly pushed it in place, with the clips attaching to both sides. There we go, it's in. And that's the... now it's got 16GB. Next up was the Radeon RX 550 graphics card. This simply required opening the latch on the case, then aligning the card with the PCIe slot on the motherboard, which was located right next to the power supply. To begin with, I had lots of difficulty getting the card inserted. I wonder why that is. Maybe it's because I didn't even remove the slot cover from the back of the case. Seriously, why do I end up doing stupid things like this when making videos? In complete embarrassment, I popped out the appropriate slot cover from the case, and then tried aligning the card with the PCIe slot again. It took some time as it needed to be lined up very precisely, but the card eventually slotted in place with the 3 DisplayPort connectors now accessible from the back of the computer. And all that was left to do was reinsert the drive bay by properly aligning it and routing the drive cables through the appropriate gaps, then securing the drive bay by simply pushing it in place, and finally reinserting the cables into both drives. Then I reattached the front panel, slid the top panel onto the case. Takes a bit of force to, there we go. And now it was time to try powering the PC on. I ensured everything was plugged into the back accordingly and inserted the DisplayPort cable into the respective port on the graphics card here. I plugged the power cable into the wall and then pressed the power button. Initially the computer did nothing, but 20 seconds later it beeped and showed a post error, complaining about the memory size being different from last startup. This isn't really an issue and of course relates to the new RAM module we just inserted. After pressing the Enter key, the PC began booting into Windows as normal and was showing a signal, which was a good start. After logging in, I opened Task Manager to check the memory usage, and it was recognising a total of 16GB of RAM with both slots used, which checks out. I then went into Windows Update to see if it was finding drivers automatically, and just as I went to check, the screen began flickering, suggesting that it was indeed installing the appropriate drivers already in the background. When I opened Task Manager to check what version it had installed, the computer suddenly froze for no reason. No input was being accepted from the mouse or keyboard. This is too reminiscent of what happened with the AMD Radeon 9200 when I inserted it into the Packard Bell 2003 PC. I held the power button to force power off the computer. I also chose to put the PC sideways and remove the top panel again so I could be sure the fan on the graphics card was even spinning. And when I booted the computer up again, the fan was indeed spinning very quietly, so that was working at least. Thankfully this time, it let me enter Device Manager without the computer freezing up, and we can see that Windows installed an outdated driver from 2022, which was apparently the latest version, even though AMD's website clearly states otherwise. Before updating the drivers though, I messed around with the PC for a bit before going to bed to ensure the graphics card was at least working. Opening GPU-Z showed all the relevant specs on the card, which lined up with what was shown on the Tech Power Up website, which I looked at earlier. I did a few races on BallisticNG and quickly saw a huge increase in performance compared to when I was using the integrated graphics. The game was perfectly playable at 1080p and ran at 60 FPS, with all the graphics pretty much maxed out. Regarding the driver situation, all I needed to do was simply a Google search for available drivers for this graphics card, and the official AMD website came up as the first result. Turns out they still support this card 8 years later, with the latest driver update being just a few weeks old, or probably over a month old by the time I actually upload this video. And now that the new hardware was properly installed and configured, it was time to run more benchmarks on this PC. I had already used the PC for over a week at this point, and didn't really run into any notable issues with the new hardware, so let's just get straight into the benchmarks. To start with, here is BallisticNG as just shown, with the resolution set to 1920 by 1080, and all the settings at their respective highest, along with VSync enabled and motion blur disabled. The game is not terribly intensive in terms of graphics, so the card was easily managing a solid 60 FPS almost flawlessly. Unfortunately, when racing on certain tracks like Zypher Climb, there were some slight drops in the frame rate, but this was often caused by heavy weapon fire and didn't really affect gameplay too much. These minor frame drops could easily be fixed by turning down some graphical settings. I also ran an eliminator race with a grid of 16 ships, probably the most intensive test possible in this game, and evidently there was lots of random stuttering all over the place. Again, this was fixable by turning down the graphics settings or limiting the frame rate to 30 FPS. Next is Crash Bandicoot, using the high preset in the graphics settings, along with 1080p resolution. Even with these demanding settings, the game always ran at around 30 to 40 FPS on every level I played, even the more intensive ones such as Snow Go on Crash 2. To keep the frame times more consistent, I tried applying a 30 FPS frame limit in River Tuner, because the in-game frame limiter doesn't do anything for some reason. I don't know if it's this hardware, but anyway, setting a 30 FPS frame limit in River Tuner helped maintain smoother gameplay with less stutter, because the frame rate was being locked to 30 FPS. It was possible to achieve 60 FPS in 1080p, but only by turning the detail way down. If you really want 60 FPS, the best option would be to decrease the resolution to 720p and use the medium preset for a balance of smooth gameplay and visual detail. Here is BeamNG Drive, again the 0.23 beta on Steam, and using 1080p resolution with the normal preset. The performance varies widely depending on the map that is loaded, so I tried 3 different ones. First, here is the Utah map. The game ran very well most of the time, with an average frame rate of 36 FPS, and the only noticeable drop in frame rate was when there was lots of smoke or scenery showing on screen. Even then, the frame rate never really dropped below 30 FPS. Not bad. And next is the Cliff map. This is one of the smallest maps in the game and does not need much power to run, so unsurprisingly the frame rate averaged 50 FPS and only dropped slightly whenever there was lots of stuff happening. Finally, I did a more intensive test, using the West Coast map and spawning multiple vehicles of different sizes. Even with lots of stuff happening at once, the frame rate was quite stable and averaged 32 FPS. Of course, setting a 30 FPS limit would result in better frame times and smoother gameplay overall. Moving on to Portal 2 from 2011. With every setting at the very highest, the frame rate averaged nearly 200 FPS when uncapped. Of course, since this monitor that I'm using is 60Hz, there's no real benefit to having the frame rate this high. It's better to set a frame limit of 60 FPS using River Tuner to keep the frame times more consistent and to reduce lots of unnecessary load on the GPU. In fact, with the frame rate uncapped, the GPU ran about 92 degrees, which is pretty much the limit before it starts to throttle. However, after enabling a 60 FPS cap, the temperature cooled down to around 75 to 80 degrees. With all that said, the game looked as good as it gets and was fully playable. Moving on to some PSP emulation. This time I set the internal resolution to 10x, which is an insane 4800 by 2720, way above the 4K resolutions you see nowadays on modern hardware. Of course, having the internal resolution set this stupidly high will not look any different than having it set to 4x, which is 1080p equivalent and the native resolution of this monitor. But nevertheless, the game still ran perfectly and maintained a solid 60 FPS with almost no real impacts on performance at all. I guess this isn't too surprising, as PSP emulation is very easy to do even on decade-old laptops, but I still think it's quite mad being able to run anything above 4K on this cheap low-power graphics card. And once again, here is AW674's Robot Wars on Roblox, this time running with the graphics set nearly at highest, and it ran very smoothly, not quite 60 FPS, but not far off either. Again, sorry for the lack of a frame rate counter on screen, but this clip should give you a good idea of how well this ran, and more notably, how awesome it looks. And to finish off the benchmarks, here is 3D Mark. To start with, let's see how much better the Steel Nomad Lite test will run with the new hardware. Earlier the score was 313 with an average frame rate of 2.3 FPS, and this time we got 8 FPS. Yes, although 3 times better than before, the performance is still shocking. But keep in mind this graphics card released in 2017 while this benchmark was first available in 2024, so it's not a surprise. The final score was 1088, again 3 times better than the integrated graphics. I then tried the TimeSpy benchmark, which was announced way back in 2016. So this should run a bit better, right? I mean, it's around the same time period as the card itself. In fact, 1 year older. But no, we still got single-digit frame rates mostly throughout the whole test. I'm starting to think the DirectX 12 support on this card is a bit non-existent. The final score was 1306. Again, much better than before, but still quite bad. And to end the benchmarks, I ran the Firestrike test from 2015, which uses DirectX 11 instead of 12. And this time we actually saw higher frame rates of around 15 to 20 FPS throughout the whole test. Not bad compared to what we just saw, although the combined test at the end did push things much harder, resulting in 6 FPS. The final score was 3718, about 4 times better than the integrated graphics. Overall, not really a bad result. One more thing I tried was recording a video in OBS and playing a game simultaneously. In this case, I recorded BallisticNG in 1080p 60 FPS, using the same graphics settings seen in the benchmarks. And the resulting video looks fine. There were almost no frame drops whatsoever, and it looks nice and smooth. Very refreshing to see compared to before, where my PC would often struggle recording this game at 720p 30 FPS without turning some settings even lower than medium.
Cannons, rockets, engine lock, autopilot engaged.
And I think that is enough testing and mucking around for now. I'm very pleased to have got this computer upgraded in some way for the first time in 2 years, and I think it's quite amazing how much of a difference just £45 worth of upgrades can really do to an old office computer like this. Of course, if this computer was not small form factor and instead a desktop variant, I could have got a desktop RX 550 card instead, which are cheaper because they're way more common than the low profile variants, but I'm still pleased with the outcome of these upgrades nevertheless. Thank you all for watching this long video, and I hope you look forward to future content.